welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. My name is Elliot Waldman, and I'm an associate editor here at WPR. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion, looking at the week's top headlines. Europe is now the epicenter of the novel coronavirus pandemic, according to the World Health Organization. The continent has reported more cases and deaths than the rest of the world combined outside China. And as of Tuesday, March 17th, Italy alone had reported more than 2,500 deaths from the illness. In response, European Union leaders held an emergency summit via video conference this week, where they announced an agreement to temporarily close all external borders to non-essential travel. COVID-19 is clearly the most urgent of many issues facing EU leaders, but it is not the only one. The Brexit process with the UK, a migration crisis on Greece's border with Turkey, and an inability to come to terms on a budget agreement are just some of the other issues that have recently dogged the European Commission's leadership. Joining us now to dig into all of this is Heather Conley. She's the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic and Director of the Europe Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. She has a range of expertise from a career working in both the private sector and in government, including a stint in the early 2000s as Deputy Assistant Director of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the State Department. Heather, welcome back to Trendlines.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you with us during these trying times. I know one of the benefits of this podcast is that all of our episodes are recorded remotely. So with you in the DC area and me here in New York, we have more than 200 miles of social distance between us.
Well, you were ahead of your time. I think we're all learning teleworking is going to be the thing we're going to be doing for the next several weeks. So great prescient foresight.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in and talk about this new measure that was announced this week. EU leaders have agreed to a 30-day ban on non-essential travel from outside the EU, although it's up to national governments to implement that. And meanwhile, Brussels has been encouraging member states to keep their own borders open to others in the bloc. How have national governments responded to that suggestion?
Yeah, national governments have really been taking decisions on their own, which in some ways this emergency conference call by EU leaders was really designed to catch up to decisions that individual member states were taking. I have to say it's been fairly chaotic and unilateral. Last week, the Austrian government closed the Austrian-Italian border. You had some that the Polish government, the Czech Republic were taking some individual steps. And so this was an attempt to try to get some coherency around the decision, but it's been extremely messy because of these individual decisions. We are now seeing upwards of 30 to 50 kilometer lines of trucks that are stalled at borders because procedures haven't been worked out to cross internal borders. So this is really the EU trying to wrestle with a very difficult decision. And of course, as they know, it's really up to the individual member state to enforce this non-essential travel ban for the next 30 days.
How do you expect member states will enforce that? Does it look like they'll actually take that seriously enough to implement it?
Well, I think individual member states are taking this very, very seriously, and they will begin to implement it. But the EU is trying to walk a very fine line, and this was very true with German Chancellor Angela Merkel's statements on March the 17th, saying that we want to make sure that we protect people and these borders closed, but we have to ensure that essential goods are able to pass among member states. And they're just having a hard time implementing that trick of closing borders, but still allowing cross-border workers to get to work if they are allowed to, and goods to cross internal borders. So I think it's going to be hugely challenging. And meanwhile, member states continue to make individual decisions. Last night, French President Emmanuel Macron announced a 15-day lockdown of France. It looks like Belgium is about to follow that course of action as well. So again, individual member states are making decisions. The Netherlands is not doing a lockdown. So again, you're going to just see a lot of confusion as they really figure out a unified policy approach.
Now, shortly before this crisis flared up, EU leaders had been arguing over a budget for the government in Brussels. What are the main issues that led to that breakdown?
I know that seems like a discussion held a long time ago. The multi-annual financial framework, it's known as the MFF. Every 7 years, the European Union creates a budget, and it's usually a little controversial. Again, the budget of the European Union is really 1% of basically the GDP for all now 27 member states. But after Brexit, there is a really big gaping hole in the next budget. And someone's got to fill that hole. And member states, those particularly that are significant contributors to the EU budget, we call them the frugal four. They're not having any of sort of additional contributions. And of course, you have other states, particularly in the South, that want to make sure that they receive additional funds, particularly if they've suffered from disproportionate numbers of migrants coming through the migration crisis. Central and Eastern Europe still want their regional infrastructure funds. And of course, France wants to maintain the common agricultural policy. So the demands are going up. The budget has already gone down. And the EU countries are having a very hard time being able to negotiate this. You put the coronavirus crisis, the pandemic, on top of this, and it just makes that negotiation all the harder. They held a summit last month. In fact, things went backwards a little bit. They didn't come out with really a good landing zone for this negotiation. So they're back at it again, and we'll see if the conversation is delayed. I'm sure it will because of the pandemic.
Obviously, the current coronavirus pandemic will create a need for some fiscal stimulus in the European Union. I was wondering if maybe there's a chance that that crisis will galvanize some of those more frugal members of the EU into agreeing to spend more. But is that what we're seeing?
Well, I think what the pandemic is doing is individual countries are making some decisions about massive stimulus. Again, French President Macron made some significant announcements the evening of March 16th, a 300 billion euro loan facility for small and medium-sized enterprises in France, 45 billion euros in sort of immediate relief to the hardest hit industries. You even have French ministers suggesting that France will have to nationalize certain large companies. So there is absolutely going to be a fiscal stimulus. They're going to blow through the EU Growth and Stability Pact, which requires no greater than a 3% budget deficit and a 60% debt cap. The EU is certainly giving them the member states flexibility. They know this is an exceptional moment, but when we talk about blowing through big deficits, France will certainly. Italy is going to continue to spend because the crisis is so severe in Italy. But again, there's not a lot of coordination with that. The Eurozone group, the Eurozone finance ministers, met on Monday, March the 16th, and could not agree on new instruments to support some of the most hard-hit member states. So lots of coordination, confusion, but again, like the border questions, individual countries taking very impressive steps unilaterally. It's unclear how they're coordinating. They do whatever it takes to try to get over the economic fallout from the pandemic.
Are there any ways that lack of coordination has hampered the response, or any other ways that the EU could potentially look to boost coordination among its member states?
Well, we saw in the very early days of the last few weeks when Italy was just really becoming overwhelmed by the crisis. Unfortunately, a call for additional medical supplies, gloves, masks, protective masks, and things. You had the case where Germany would not allow their stocks to go to Italy. Again, this was member states preserving their own emergency medical stockpiles for their own populations. The EU did step in to try to manage some of that and try to ensure that there was solidarity. But here you had 2 days or several days ago, China sending a plane load of medical supplies, those masks, those protective gear and ventilators, medical equipment. It's interesting that the crisis is now growing significantly in Spain. Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez just asked for Chinese help with humanitarian supplies as well. So that solidarity gap is being met in some ways, but by the Chinese, not by the European Union or the United States for that matter.
Looking ahead, how do you imagine all of this will play out in terms of its impact on the idea of a Europe that projects, as President Macron likes to say?
Yes, I mean, again, Europe and the European Union has always believes itself to be forged through crises, and certainly the pandemic is a generational crisis. I think, again, the challenge is the European institutions are not yet complete and ready to be able to play that geopolitical role that both the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen continues to repeat. And I think, again, the ambitions that President Macron has continued to say, he wants Europe to be strong and unified and be influential in a world where great powers, Russia, China, the United States, are using their influence. The challenge is, again, we see it play over and over again. The nation state continues to make decisions, particularly when it comes to its financial health and its borders. That's sovereignty. And it's difficult for the 27 members of the European Union to find that commonality. You're talking about 27 extremely different countries in outlook and in economic size and weight and culture. And it's very difficult to find that unifying element. So the crisis helps forge the institutions, but I think crisis after crisis over the last decade has started to fray some of that EU unity and solidarity, which unfortunately undercuts the entire project.
We've also seen some other broad currents recently that the EU has had to grapple with. One example is the rise of populist governments and Eurosceptic governments. And they're not just skeptical of Brussels, they're skeptical of scientific and technical expertise. And in some cases that I've been tracking outside of Europe, we've seen populist governments initially shrug off this coronavirus and now face a backlash for that. President Trump here in the United States, President Bolsonaro in Brazil. Are we seeing a similar phenomenon among any European populist leaders?
Well, I think it's actually, we're seeing a bit of the opposite, and I'll use the example of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Certainly during the 2016 Brexit referendum, there was an absolute shunning of expertise. The experts knew nothing. It's been during this crisis that Prime Minister Johnson has continually flanked himself with the UK's chief medical officer, its chief epidemiologist, has basically been reinforcing that all I'm doing is listening to the experts. Now, interestingly, the Prime Minister Johnson has been criticized that he's been taking too slow of approach, but he's trying to say, I've been listening to my experts. So I think there's been a little less of an issue in Europe. Again, in Italy, you had former Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini, leader of the Lega party, certainly criticizing the Italian coalition government for a poor, lackluster response, trying to foist blame on the government. But I think, again, in Italy, the crisis is so dire and so dramatic. I think once Italy and Spain and others get through this most acute phase, I think you'll then see probably where the populists and nationalists will try to reassert themselves, perhaps. But right now in this acute phase, I think it's very difficult. The nation is hurting. You want to be unified in helping the nation get through that. And hopefully when things subside, unfortunately, populists and nationalists will pick up where they left off.
We've also seen some ramifications for relations with the U.S. amid this crisis. A lot of European leaders objected to President Trump's announcement recently of a broad travel restriction on people trying to come to the U.S. from Europe. How do you expect this crisis will affect transatlantic relations?
Well, just as it's been very difficult within the EU itself and its members to coordinate and organize themselves, it's been absolutely terrible transatlantically. And I think really the culmination of that was President Trump's Oval Office announcement that he was banning travel from Europe, and the announcement occurred in the middle of the night. In Europe, there was no coordination. Leaders were caught flat-footed. Certainly, Americans and Europeans on both sides of the Atlantic were scrambling, trying to figure out. There was such chaos and confusion. Again, this is where if I think we had a different set of international leadership and a mindset, you'd see a much more purposeful coordination, not only obviously the economic and the financial coordination of allowing greater liquidity through the system, making sure that banks are able to manage this dire economic challenge, but also the coordination, whether that's medical supplies, scientists, making sure there's transparency, whether that's the G7, whether that's the G20. None of that really has been happening, despite the fact that the United States chairs the G7 this year. And of course, after the chaos of the travel announcement, we've continued to see lack of coordination. There was a press report that the United States was very interested in procuring a German vaccine company, but perhaps to purchase it to make sure that those vaccines would be developed for Americans, not again for all to benefit from finding a vaccine for the novel coronavirus. So it's just been very scratchy. There hasn't been coordination, and it just comes on top of 3.5 years of transatlantic scratchiness, and none of this helps. It just reinforces those stress fractures in the relationship.
You mentioned that chaotic Oval Office address and the aftermath and the confusion among officials last week. It struck me as reminiscent of the early days of Trump's presidency when he tried to roll out the travel ban on 6 countries with sizable Muslim populations, and there was mass chaos at airports with people unsure of what to do, whether people with green cards could come in, etc. I'm wondering if you see any signs that this has affected perceptions of the U.S. In Europe outside of diplomatic circles.
Oh my goodness, it certainly has. Again, I think you're right. It isn't just addressing the coronavirus pandemic in isolation. It's really been several years. If you think about 2 years ago when Prime Minister Trudeau and Canada hosted the G7, the president walking away from that meeting and statement. It's been the difficulties at NATO. It's been the fact that President Trump refers to the European Union very frequently as America's greatest foe. It's worse than China. Those kinds of rhetoric makes it so difficult to, when we need to work together, that our European counterparts have the political space and ability to take tough steps that serve U.S. interests. If the perception is that the U.S. In some ways, from a European perspective, is no different from Russia or China, then we really have lost our greatest asset. America's greatest comparative advantage is our allies, are this rich global allied system. And the more we do to push those allies away, all that does is weaken the United States, and it makes those allies look to China and Russia either to find some accommodation because they cannot manage the challenges that they present to them. And this, again, is absolutely undercuts U.S. strategic interests and our national security.
Coming back to Europe itself and the response to this crisis, I have a sense of how you might answer this based on our conversation so far, but I still want to put it to you directly. Will the EU emerge from this crisis more unified or more divided than before?
I hope through this crisis, Europe comes out of it more united. That's my hope. My concern is that it has just been a series of crises, beginning with the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, followed very quickly by the unfolding Eurozone crisis, Russia's intervention in Ukraine, the migration crisis, Brexit, the U.S. questioning the transatlantic relationship, and now a coronavirus. You just feel like there's this steady growth, cumulative effect of crises where instead of looking towards each other for strength, you're starting to see where they're just taking independent national decisions on their own. And that just ultimately weakens the European Union structurally. And that itself, I think, is probably not the focus of enough policymakers, that if Europe does not come through this crisis stronger, but in fact more weakened, it could be more susceptible to Chinese influence, Russian influence. It's the anti-American sentiment that's growing across Europe could grow to a point where the U.S. loses its ally and Europe becomes so weakened. It becomes, again, a financial contagion that could unleash a different set of global economic and financial challenges. So the stakes couldn't be any higher.
We have seen criticism of President Trump, as you alluded to, that he's stigmatizing China, scapegoating with his tweets referring to a Chinese virus, quote unquote. Are we seeing anything similar in Europe right now?
So you're definitely seeing some comments from Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He has brought together the novel coronavirus and migrants, where his view is that this virus was brought by migrants traveling through Iran. And this is why it was very prescient of the Hungarian government to have the strictest anti-immigrant policy in the EU and put up borders and barriers in 2016, well before anybody else was doing so. So again, I think when you have populists and nationalists, or you have mainstream parties that begin to sound and echo their comments, for a populist, there is always someone to blame because they never take accountability and responsibility for their actions. So you can blame a migrant, you can blame other forces, outsiders, but never take accountability. And if anything, democratic governance is all about accountability and transparency. Unfortunately, there are some irresponsible political figures on the left and the right that will use this pandemic to further their short-term political interests. Unfortunately, all it does is harm the citizens of that country even more.
Heather, thanks again for joining us. Is there anything else you think worth mentioning that we didn't cover?
Well, I think we're going to have to just watch the impact of the virus on the Brexit negotiations. This week, negotiators from the UK and the EU were to meet in London. They originally thought they could do it via conference or video conference. They ended up not proceeding, canceling negotiations. There's going to be an enormous amount of political pressure on Prime Minister Boris Johnson to seek an extension to those negotiations because of the pandemic. And he is going to, I think, be placed in a very difficult position. On the one hand, his entire political mantra of getting Brexit done and putting some finality to the future trade relationship between the UK and the EU is so strong. But at the same time, the economics of the pandemic suggest that the wisest thing would be to extend that negotiation until there's stability in the global economic system. So we're going to watch that one play out over time. But this will impact the UK profoundly, and certainly its future trade relationship, not only with the EU, but potentially the US as well.
Well, I'll be keeping an eye on that. It's great to talk with you as always, Heather. Appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Heather Conley is Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic and Director of the Europe Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.